Today I want to talk to you about what I think is the most incredible balancing act in sailing. Actually no, the most incredible balancing act in world sport. And that is the balance of an AC75 at full flight. There's so much incredible physics about how this happens, what goes on. And I just thought it was about time we appreciated it, discussed exactly how these boats are kept aloft, flying kind of inches from the water surface, who on board is managing that flight, what systems, all that kind of questions about how these boats work. I'm going to attempt to explain how these forces find themselves in perfect harmony with the boat hovering across the surface. And actually I'm going to tie it a bit back into just regular dinghy sailing, because when you do pull it back to the base forces involved, it's actually quite a similar process to, a regular dinghy or a kid in an oppie. So yeah, really interesting point. Okay, so let's look at the boat from behind, and we'll start off talking about the roll balance, the heeling as we call it in yachts. How do those forces resolve? Well, the first force, which is pretty obvious, is that the boat's not sinking. So we've got a lifting force there, and it's discussed in the commentary all the time. The foil, leeward foil down in the water is lifting the boat up. Makes kind of perfect sense. But if the foil is lifting up from out of the side of the boat, why wouldn't the boat just topple over in the other direction? And this force is primarily achieved by the force of the wind on the sails. So that's going to put a lateral push on the sail and on the yacht sideways, holding it back upright. Now, if you've got the foils pushing up and you've got the wind pushing sideways, then the resultant force is just for the boat to move up in the air sideways forever. So there's got to be some force which is stopping the boat from slipping sideways, and there's got to be some force which is holding the boat down back in equilibrium. Well, simply put, the biggest force just holding the boat down is going to be gravity. So the boat's all out to windward and gravity is holding it down. So that lifting force on the leeward foil is got to always be in complete equilibrium with the gravity holding the boat down. A few exceptions, but pretty much that's it. So you've got to have as much vertical lift from the foil as you do gravity holding the boat down. So next is, if there's a side force on the side from the sails, why doesn't the boat just slip sideways all the time? Well, there's got to be a lateral force from the foil as well opposing that. And what you end up with is this kind of force square. So you'll have your lateral force from the wind on the mast, you've got the gravity holding the boat down, and these are opposed by the lift on the boat pushing up and the lateral force pushing sideways. And when these are perfectly balanced, then you've got a stable flight. That's kind of like the basics of it, and you just got to get those forces in balance. But that's an incredibly difficult job. These aren't boats which are propelled by an engine where you've got a constant thrust. They're propelled by the wind, and the wind is hugely gusty and shifty. Second to second there are variations in the amount of energy available. So this lateral force at the top on the mast is constantly changing. And as that changes, you've got to adjust everything else to keep the forces in balance. Okay, so we've got this diagram of the forces of balancing an AC75, and I guess one of the questions is whether
this resultant force from the foil has to be completely equal and opposite to the kind of like sum of the lateral side force, centre of effort on the sail, plus the centre of gravity, down force from the weight of the boat and the rudder. So do the sum of these two have to be completely equal and opposite and pointing directly at one another? It's kind of an interesting question. You can kind of run around in circles around the kind of leverage moments of the boat, how far out it is. But actually, if you just ignore the shape of this boat and think that's just a solid piece connecting these 2 points, then that shape of the boat could be any shape. It could even just be a straight line, a pen, a column between the two. If you think of it like this, ignore the shape of the boat, it's just connecting 2 points in space, like the pen is just connecting 2 points in space. If I want this pen to stay stationary between my 2 fingers and not move around, the force from my right hand needs to be completely equal and opposite from the force in my left hand. So if I increase the lateral force in this left hand, the pen will move that way, so that'll be like the boat heeling to leeward. If I increase the weight of the boat or the downforce on the rudder, the boat will heel to leeward. And same with the foil at the bottom. If I increase the lateral lift of the foil, the boat will heel to leeward. And if I increase the lift, the boat will move out the water, but also heel to windward. Now, this isn't actually very different at all from your regular dinghy. In my RS800, where I trapeze out on the sail, these are actually the exact same forces in motion as what you have, in an RS800 skiff, in a just sitting out dinghy, right the way down to your oppie. The difference is, in our regular boats, this lift force is all buoyancy, so we never have to really think about trimming buoyancy. It's just there. The water's displaced, whatever weight we put in the boat displaces it, and it just gives us buoyancy. So we never really have to think about this lift in our normal sailing. Next we have the lateral force. And again, most of us have a centreboard which creates this lateral force. We don't ever really trim the centreboard in terms of its angle of incidence to the boat. We just, it just is where it is. It's symmetrical underneath the boat, and as we have a side force on the sails, that'll make the centreboard kind of slip sideways through the water, which will give it an angle of attack, and it will create a positive force in the opposite direction. So in a normal dinghy, this whole kind of like force vector here is kind of self-equalizing to the center of effort and the weight of the boat. The only thing that we do really trim is this lateral force in the sail and our righting moment. So who's controlling these forces, and how is it being controlled in the boat? Well, let's talk about INEOS, because they're probably the boat that I've spent the longest time looking at the stern cam. First of all, you have the foil lift. That's being controlled by the foil controllers, and INEOS have 2, Jerry Newton on port and Lee McMillan on starboard. They actually control the foil that's on their side of the boat. So on port tack, Lee McMillan be controlling the ride height, the foil, the lift, keeping the boat up and down in the water. However, it's not just Lee's job controlling the lift on that main foil, because there's a secondary input here as well, and that's the rudder pitch. So as the rudder, so this is the main foil, this is a rudder, if you change the angle of attack on the rudder, it will pull down the back of the boat, or it will lift up the back of the boat. And by changing the whole pitch of the boat, it will change the angle of attack on the main foil. And the main foil then get more lift and lift up. If you
pitch down the back of the boat, or if you lift up the back of the boat, it'll pitch down the main foil will go down. So who's doing pitch? Well, sometimes it's Giles Scott when the other flight controller is trimming, but often it is the flight controller on the windward side who is controlling the pitch of the boat, and that also contributes to this kind of equilibrium of keeping the lift exactly equal and opposite to the weight of the boat and the downforce in the rudder. So what other forces we've got? We've got a lateral side force on the sail, and this has always got to be equal and opposite to the lateral force on what would normally be the centreboard, but is in these boats also the foil to leeward on its angle. So who controls that? Well, the leeward board, you've got the flight controller, and they can kind of control to a degree how much lift that board is giving and the kind of how much flap they're putting down. But mostly the leeway, the amount of kind of angle of attack of that foil, will be controlled a lot by the amount of lateral force in the sail. Now obviously that lateral force has to kind of find its way as part of this perfect square. So there's got to be a control of that lateral side force in the sail. How's that being controlled? Well, there's actually two people, probably three actually. You could count the jib trimmer in this as well, because obviously jib's adding some lateral side force. Primarily you've got the main trimmer though, and on INEOS that's Bleddyn Mon. And what's he doing to control that lateral side force? Well, when you get a gust, an increase in power, you've already at maximum leverage. There's no more weight you can put out. What Bleddyn will have to do is release the angle of attack on the mainsail so that the lateral side force on the sail remains in equilibrium with that force vector. So to do that, you can drop the traveller down, dead simple. However, if you're overpowered and you're dropping your traveller down, it's not really an ideal situation, because then you have the same deep powerful mainsail but you just eased it out more, and it readily kind of starts creating a lot of drag. So what you want to do is harness some of that extra power and have more lateral side force. And the only way you can really balance this with your righting moment is to move that centre of effort in the sail down lower and lower. And what this means is twisting off the top of the sail so that you're not using the top of the rig to tip the boat over so much, and you're getting your drive all deep down low in the boat. However, that extra lateral force has to be met somewhere, so it's going to put more load on the centreboard or on the foil to leeward. So that has to be met either with increased leeway or with more flap on the main foil. So that's got to be met by the flight controller. Finally, it's not just Bleddyn who's controlling the angle of attack of that mainsail. You've also got Ben Ainsley who's steering the boat. If you head up into the wind but don't change your traveller height, you're effectively easing that sail, you're changing the angle of attack. So when they hit a gust, they've got a few options. Either Ben Ainsley can steer up a little bit, Bleddyn Mon can drop the traveller, or potentially the flight controller could open up the flap angle so you make more leeway and slip sideways more. All of those controls will keep that force square in perfect balance. So I think all of these balancing of these forces in combination just kind of highlights how incredible the achievement of flying an AC75 is. Incredibly interesting situation just from a physics point of view, but then the fact that they're racing these boats around a course in competition, thinking about match racing tactics, strategy about the course at the same time, it's a compelling sport. So I hope you find this video interesting, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to the racing next weekend with Luna Rossa against INEOS Team UK. Super pumped for that, so I'll catch back in with you a bit of thoughts about the racing.